Hello and welcome to the Unusual Stories podcast. My name is Wojciech Salski, I'll be your host for today. And before we start, as per usual, may I remind you, if you'd like to support this podcast in any way, if you find it useful, interesting, entertaining, please share it with a friend, either on social media or maybe just send them a link. That helps a lot, and I can see it happening, and it is beautiful, and it definitely helps me bring my ideas on, which are not really that many of them mine. They're usually a sort of reviewed ideas from the books I encounter and from the things I experience, and also just share it with a wider audience, right? So secondly, please feel free to click the subscribe or follow button. I'll make sure then that the next episode that comes out, or this one and the next, shows up on your feed, and you can listen to it. And finally, if you'd like to support the podcast in any other way, maybe send me an email, suggest a book that I should read, maybe support me financially, then please follow the link below. Everything is there, and I'm really keen to hear about your experience. Thank you so much for those that have already interacted with me, and it warms my heart, and it definitely adds to this wonderful adventure that podcasting is for me. So thank you for being a part of this journey. Now let's jump right in. So for today, guys, I must say this is yet again probably one of the more challenging books for me to even put forward for you. So I'll do my best to try, but it really is a really really intense invitation for you to read it. If this episode inspires you, please read the book, because it's just so dense, and there are so many things that I'd like to touch with you that I know I won't be able to touch all of them. That ultimately I feel like this is the kind of book that everyone should read, and I will explain in due time why I think that. So the book is called The Sovereign Individual, and it's written by three authors, James Davidson, Peter Thiel, and William Rees-Mogg. So I probably butchered some of those surnames, so sorry, gents. So yeah, it's a book written in 1997, which, funnily enough, is when I was born. So that was quite a nice sort of surprise for me to entertain, to consider. And maybe to start with, the context is basically these three authors are discussing, looking back and looking forward. They're discussing the likely impact that the information age and the rise in technology in the 21st century will have on the way we live, will have on the way the states are structured, in the way nations are, formed and reformed. And the majority of the book sort of goes back in time and analyzes which changes, what made the changes happen, and sort of what these changes in the way civilization of man formed and reformed, how did they impact the way we live. And so based on that, they now put the second part of the book is a sort of a thesis, maybe, that we're on the cusp of this major change, and there will be some things that we can look forward to, as well as some things we should look out for as we go into the 21st century. And for me, it's particularly interesting, and I think for the majority of my listeners, it will be as well, because I see what the demographics of you guys is, that we are, like, literally, the book was written when I was born. I am living this change. And the fact that I'm speaking to you, from a wardrobe-sized room, on a very budget, tight podcast, and I can do it, and I've been doing it consecutively without much interruption, if any. This is just one of the many things that this technology information era change allowed us to experience. And so, I don't want to jump way ahead of myself. I'll talk about that in the second part of the podcast, let's say. But I think this is particularly, sort of exciting for us as young, sort of fairly young still, human beings, that we are literally living the changes these authors are pointing out to observe. So I think that's particularly exciting, and which is also why I think this book is very, very relevant. Probably one of the most relevant books we've had a chance to discuss on this podcast. So, as I said, I'll try to tackle it. Please forgive me, that I'll probably not make it just perfectly. But the idea here is that I'll put forward the ideas I found really interesting. I'll also explain in broader terms, as far as I can, sort of the transitions that the authors pointed out between the tribalism, city-states, 10th century church, 15th century nation states, and then 20th century technology. And then we'll go into the thesis of the authors. But before we do that, may I just maybe briefly explain to you what a sovereign individual mean for this title, because it might, English might not be your first language. Maybe you don't know what sovereign means. In terms of a sovereign, the word sovereign means a ruler or a monarch, someone who has the power, right, to lead, to rule over something. So it's a kind of play on words, this title, because a sovereign individual means the individual themselves has the power to rule, right? So back in the day, there was a king, and so the king would be the ruler, and so the king was the sovereign, and then the individuals were sort of the subjects of the king. Now, what James, Peter, and William are putting forward is, in this technology-driven new era, it will be the individuals that become the kings. We will have the ability to be our own rulers. And I mean, that's I think as far as we can go without showing too much. And so let's go back in time a little bit, and let's put some context to this. So in terms of the trajectory the civilization went, as we understand it in our contemporary history, the authors point out these sort of four major changes, right? So initially, our ancestors initially were sort of traveling around. They would gather in tribes or smaller groups. It was usually up to 150 members, and up until the time when actually the agricultural revolution happened, which is when the ancestors decided that maybe it will be better to tend to the land and to take care of some domesticated animals instead of hunting and gathering and traveling all the time. The first likeness entities to a city-state appeared. And so this is the time when, city-states such as Athens that we know in the West, or Sumer to begin with, formed, right? And these grew in size as over time these entities obviously drawn more and more people in. And so there was more work, so more people were needed, so more people arrived. And so since more people arrived, there was more work to do. And this sort of really accelerated the sort of compression of human civilization in a smaller space, in a more closed together space. And now this is the first transition, let's say, from tribalism, hunter-gatherers, into the city-states. And then from the city-states, in the 10th century, another major transition happened, which was the emergence of the church. So especially when we're thinking about the Western civilization, the rise of the power of the church was greatly accelerated by the Caesar at the time, and the Roman Empire sort of having the power that it was driven by initially was also accelerated by the power of this church state appearing. And so between the 10th century and the 15th century in Europe and around Europe, the church state was actually the greatest power, right? So even though there were lords and kings and knights and princes, it was usually the Pope who would have the final say when there was a conflict between the two kingdoms. There was a lot of effort exerted in all countries subjected to the Pope, to make sure that the Pope was on their side. It was very much so a business. It was very much so a political entity. It was basically a king, just a king under a different sort of emblem. And, it is no surprise that the Pope exerted such a big power and sort of was seen as a powerful figure, because if you consider that the kings claimed to be the king because they were granted these kingly powers from God, from this higher source, then the Pope, who was supposedly the granted translator of the higher source, a mediator between a higher source and the kings and kingdoms, then obviously this guy suddenly is much higher in this hierarchy than the kings themselves, and therefore a monopoly on power sort of was amassed around the Pope. And we will come back to the 15th century church later on, because that topic, that subject in the book was particularly shocking for me and interesting. But let me continue with our timeline. So tribalism, city-states, 10th century church-led states, and then in the 15th century, because of the emergence of the printing press, as well as of the emergence of the gunpowder, the power shifted once again. So the printing press basically took away the monopoly on information from the church, which is really important. Think about it. Before the printing press appeared, it was really inefficient, really expensive, really inefficient, and really difficult and complex to reproduce any sort of text, which is why the monasteries and the Pope had almost full monopoly on reproduction of texts, where the historic legislature, whatever, which meant it was very easy to censor any ideas that were not, sort of fitting to the narrative of the church. They had a monopoly of information. Now the printing press appears, and it doesn't take long until Luther, from the Reformation, promotes his new ideas, very reformatory ideas in sort of in contrast to the church. And funnily, the authors actually point out that maybe Luther was actually the the first how did they call it? The first noted example of a viral sort of going viral, because very quickly reproduced, reprinted works appeared all around the Europe, the medieval Europe, and this allowed for the church to lose its power, its monopoly on information. And so people started to learn, so people started to exchange information freely, more freely, let's say. And suddenly someone without much education, power, and sort of resources was able to produce and promote their work. And an interesting thing that happened as well is also this is when the local, not even national yet, we'll come back to that, but local languages emerged as the major form of communication between the texts. So if you think about it, the church had the monopoly on written word, and it was all in Latin. And obviously Latin was not known for the majority of the kingdoms around Europe and around the world for that matter. Therefore, it was actually not accessible, which also meant that the church had the monopoly on translating for people, explaining what the text meant, which is also another can of worms if you think about it, because if I would read a book right now and it's in another language, let's say Polish, I could actually say whatever I want to say to you, what the book is about, and you couldn't even fact check me. Obviously, nowadays you can get the book and translate it with ChatGPT or whatever, but the point here is, at the time they couldn't, right? So I could literally just spew a complete bunch of nonsense at you and you would still have to believe me, really, take it at the face value. And so this emergence of free printing, very cheap way of reprinting, obviously meant that also the local authorities and local merchants that wanted to produce books and distribute them to sell were more inclined to produce with local authors who were cheaper because they spoke the local language, and it was more likely that the book will sell because locals wouldn't read Latin, which meant even more of a demise for the church's iron grip on printing and on written word, because no one wanted to read Latin they didn't understand. Instead, they wanted to read in French or in Slavic or whatever language. So that's a major change, right? And then the 15th century arrives. This is when it all happens. And what another major invention was pointed out was the invention of gunpowder. Because up until the invention of gunpowder, the order was very dependent, and we'll come back to this idea in a few minutes. The order was dependent on the monopoly for potential violence, and since it was all about who has the biggest stick, and it was very pricey yet again to have a full body armor and a crafted sword or a full army for that matter, it was very expensive for any individual to actually be able to defend themselves, which is why feudal environment showed up in the first place. People coming back to this agricultural revolution, people started to plant their seeds and stay in one place, and so they were much easier to raid. They actually had things they were likely to lose. And so there became this institution of a knight or a local, warrior, whose only job was to fight for that village or for that city state, which also meant that the local village would potentially gather funds together so they could fund an armor and a sword for the knight and a horse. And the knight would be there to defend the village from local, thieves or whatever. But that also meant, obviously, if you bring someone to your house and they have a gun, let's say, and you tell them to guard your house, on one hand they are guarding your house, on another you could argue that at that point they are in charge of the house because now they have a bigger stick than you. And so obviously abuse was a side effect of this division of power, right? On one hand, you had this knight that was likely to defend your village. On another hand, this same knight could potentially be the one asking you to give up some of your resources because otherwise, they're going to kill you. Now, gunpowder shows around and it drastically discounts the price on self-defense. Think about it. It took immense resources to develop the body armor and a sword and to get a horse. Now, with gunpowder, obviously the gun was still fairly expensive, but it was very easy to use. You were unlikely to be at a sort of disadvantage in comparison to the other guy having a gun. It equaled the playing field for people's independent fighting. And so suddenly, an average farmer that just invested in a gun was potentially able to defend themselves against this knight that, a few centuries earlier was the only guy on the block with a stick. And this change of a printing press emergence and the gunpowder emergence brings us to the rise of nation states. Now, how did they define nation states in the book? An interesting thing to note, an important thing to note, especially I think in our political climate right now and with all the divisions that are happening. Consider this. Before the 15th century, no one cared about your nationality. Nationality did not exist as a concept that was considered. So it was very popular, it was common that you had a village and people in that village might have been speaking 4 different languages. They could come from all different areas of the world. There was no problem in having some newcomers join the village if they contributed towards the village and if they were happy to join in with the local laws. No one cared whether you were, black, white, or a different color. No one cared what language you spoke. Obviously, people cared that you would be okay with everyone else. And I think that's reasonable to say, in general, you don't want to be sitting in a room with someone that is causing problems. But no one cared for the nationality. Nationality was not a thing. It was very much so about, our village, our city-state, our kingdom. And even as the kings and princes of those local communities, they had to incentivize their subjects to be able to be those kings and queens. And how would they do that was to make sure, as very similarly as that example of a guy with a bigger stick, or a mafia for that matter, is they would exercise power in the local community by promising defending people from harm if they subjugate themselves underneath the king or queen. And fair enough, they might have had excuses like, oh, I'm from God, or I'm the descendant of whoever. It didn't really matter. The local lords and the local villagers were really caring only about their own safety and security, and that was the bargain made, right? They gave up some of their independence for the security at a discounted price, because they didn't have to all fight and all raise funds all together all the time to have a standing army. Instead, there was a king with the standing army and villages and little lords that were just minding their own business and, being taxed to contribute towards that army. Now, 15th century rolls around. All this happens, printing press and gunpowder. The church is greatly hindered, and we'll talk about that later when we talk about the demise of the nation state. And so there has to be a new way of dividing the world, right? There has to be a new way to raise people to be subjects to one another. And this brings us to an idea of a nation. Now, the idea of a nation initially was about the language. So since printing happened and it allowed people to bring communities together around their languages, laws started to be filed in their language rather than Latin. And this actually had the major impact in the formation of the nation state. The thing is, though, and this is the fun fact that the authors share about France around that time, is there was not many French that spoke French that we consider to be the French today in France. And so what should the administration of the country do to make sure that people consider themselves to be French if not many of them actually speak the same language? So this brought in this idea of nationalization, meaning teaching people a form of a language that everyone can understand, the lingua franca. And also this brought people together around this idea that since we all speak the same language right now, since we understand one another, we have the same values because we are the same nation. And suddenly, this nation state emerged. So instead of a king or a queen, or maybe the king or queen were still there, but they were on a different basis, now it was all about where do you come from, what language do you speak. And still, it was, at that point, it was not yet, the emergence of racism and nationalistic sort of negativity did not arise straight away, but obviously they were going to be the side effects of this new emergence, because if people suddenly start dividing themselves and judging themselves based on the language they speak and the place they come from, it's much easier to make assumptions about the other and to judge us versus them. It's just a different idea group. And so a different side effect emerges, right? Beforehand, the side effect was the religion wars, right? Religious wars and crusades and everything, and all kinds of heretics and stuff. While in the nation state time, the division is obviously based on the nationality, the language, or the color of one's skin. If we superficially assume that, for example, a Polish person is white, which is a superficial assumption, because there are Polish people that are not white, but you can see how these ideas can be very dangerous because of this new set of ideas to divide us with. Because, a fun fact, you need to divide to conquer. And so to conquer the communities and to make sure that they are still the subjects to this new state that emerged, they had to divide people somehow. So this is the tribalism to city-states, city-states to the church, church to the nation-state, and now 20th century rolls around, and the book treats quite extensively on what happened in the 20th century. You know, how did that, what effect did that have on the perception of the nation state? And for example, an interesting thing that they point out is, if it wasn't for the people believing in being so close, you know, wholeheartedly close to the idea of the state being the motherland, the fatherland, and this propaganda that was shared during the Second World War, that you're supposed to defend your fatherland or your motherland, which obviously brings it much more home, because we are biologically wired to defend our offspring and our kin. It's just a survival instinct because it's the same genes. So, you know, it goes very, very deep easily that that this is the case. Then by addressing people as you will be defending motherland, fatherland, by by fighting in this war, obviously it sold the idea to people that they are defending their families, which might not have been the case. One can argue. Obviously, this is just the ideas that are pointed out in the book for you to consider. Now, the 20th century rolls around, and this also brings a huge rise in technologies. All kinds of technologies, you know, I'm not going to be listing them out for you here, but some of them are very, very much so groundbreaking. And the biggest groundbreaking one is obviously the emergence of radio, television, and then internet. And this brings us swiftly to the beginning of the 21st century, where suddenly the authors call it the information age or the digital age. And suddenly the information is so available and it's so discounted that almost all kinds of censorship, which were obviously the on the backbone of this monopoly on information around the nation state, disappear. You know, and one could argue maybe nowadays we have it the other way around, that actually because there is so much information, it's even difficult to know what to believe or what to consider valuable. That's another problem maybe to address at a different episode. But to consider still, the idea here is that basically information becomes available to all. We can communicate freely with one another among the city-states, among the nation-states, among the religions. I can communicate to you, and I assume quite a few of you are from countries I've not had a chance to visit yet. I know, for example, that the majority of the listeners is from United States, and I'm yet to have a chance to visit. So, you know, suddenly we can... The borders sort of are blurred once again. These borders that emerged as a side effect of a nation state now are sort of blurred out again, especially in the case of social mobility, you know, and international mobility. The mere fact that I am a Polish sort of Poland-born guy living in the UK is a testament to this situation. I know, you know, one of my siblings is living abroad as well in a different country in Europe, and we're very privileged to be able to choose where we live. And the authors of the book, to which we'll come back later as well a little bit more, suggest, they theorize that the emergence of this freedom of information and freedom of sort of communication allows us to become more and more independent of the nation state, and therefore more likely to choose where we want to live going forward. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's the timeline I wanted to share with you to start with, which took me 30 minutes, which is crazy. So I'll take a sip of a coffee right now as you consider tribalism, city-states, church states, nation states nowadays. Wonderful. It's cold already. Okay, so let's continue, right? So the idea I would like to share with you right now, as we've already discussed the background, let's say for this all, is the idea of the information age technologies being the power to free individuals from under the nation state's boot. And in terms of the three major ones that the authors point to, and I'll try to sort of maybe touch on each of them slightly, but I don't want to dwell too much on this part, is the information becoming very cheap to both produce, like I do right now, and receive, like you do right now, probably for free. Direct and all around the world communication, yet again, sort of same space here. I have the ability to call my parents over the phone straight away, and I have the ability to message my friend who's on the other side of the world, and they get the message in seconds. And the cryptocurrency. So the emergence of a form of currency that is independent of the nation state. And this is the, I think, the biggest most impactful power. And let me just briefly explain why. So in The Sovereign Individual, the authors point out that ultimately power of all these, stages, tribalism, city-states, church, nation-states, and right now, comes down to who has the monopoly on violence, who can be the one to deal the lethal blow, right? So when it was tribes, obviously the monopoly on violence was offered to the alpha in the group, or the chieftain of a local tribe. And obviously if one tribe was stronger than another, then they were more likely to cause harm and therefore have monopoly on power. Then the city-states rolled around, and the monopoly of power was given in the hands of the whatever congregation of the local knights and lords would be. And therefore these individuals, these groups of power were the ones with the biggest stick. Then as the church state emerged, it was the church and the church's subsidiaries that had the monopoly on power and the ability to cause the greatest to deal the greatest blow to their subjects. Then the nation state emerges, and yet again the nation state has the power, and you can feel it right now, even with censorship, which is actually sadly enough part and parcel of our daily life today with some of the social media platforms. Or if I were to suddenly offer you some ideas here in this podcast that are potentially not in line with whatever the government out there would like to hear, my podcast could be taken down. And so the monopoly on power and on violence came into the nation state. Obviously, it's very difficult to be fighting with a nation state as an individual. And you see it by people being put to jail, or by people being, deported or killed. And then finally, the now rolling around into this 21st century, the emergence of cryptocurrencies, it allows people to have an independence of currency. And that's a big change, because with all these powers that we've discussed before comes the monopoly on the value of things, value of resources, right? Whether it was gold coins or the fiat currencies issued by the governments, or the credits offered by the church. All these were part and parcel of the monopoly on power by the government and the country. With a cryptocurrency, which as Bitcoin, for example, I don't want to touch any others because there are slight differences between them, but let's focus on Bitcoin only. Because of the way it is designed, it is very difficult for the government to control it. And therefore, it actually is standing outside of this area of monopoly on violence and monopoly on power. It's impossible to be taxed, for example. It's impossible to be sort of taken away by the government. And this is a big change, because what it means, and since also that's an interesting fact to note, because it's not something material, I can travel from one country to another with it in my portfolio, and I won't be, it's impossible for someone to rob me unless they know my key, password, or whatever access to my ledger, which basically means it's not something you can take away. For example, if I decide to move away from your country, you cannot take it away from me. And such powers have been exercised before by countries on, in the with the aim of keeping people in, right? If I want to move out, but I have a house and a bunch of gold in the background in my garden, it's much more easy for the local government to not allow me to leave with all these things. Therefore, I will be taxed for leaving, and so I'm sort of coerced into staying. If I have something that is intangible for them to grasp, it's much more easy for me to take myself out of this sticky situation. And so the theory here is that people will be able to choose their place of living based on the qualities, values, and incentives they will look for there. And we can already see it. Some countries offer visas for digital workers, for people that will have a certain level of income and work remotely, and so they can move there and live there, therefore, for example, avoiding greater taxation in their country of origin. Or some countries allow people to deal in certain currencies, for example, or some countries base their local currency on Bitcoin, like El Salvador, which greatly changes the fabric of how the country is offered to others. And so obviously this is not to say that the change has already happened and you can go wherever you want, but the thesis that was put forward by these three gentlemen in 1997 seems to be not far from the truth, that there are already incentives and ways of us exercising the power of voting with our feet, as it's called. So I move away to a different country because I can, and therefore I take the benefits from that different country over the benefits that potentially I had in my own. Now, since we've already been talking for 40 minutes, so I might as well share the final point with you and let you off the hook. As I said, this book is dense, and so I'm trying my best to fill out the many holes. Now about the nation state's demise, and this is the most interesting part, I think, for us, because it's going to be very difficult for what the part that I'm going to say from now onwards might be very difficult to accept, understand, or grasp for people that were brought up in the 20th and the 19th century. And this is because if you are brought up in a certain way, you know, if you are brought up in the belief that the nation state is all there is, and you are Polish, you are British, you are whatever, it's quite difficult, if not offensive, for people to reconsider whether these things are true. It's difficult for us to accept things we've believed to be true if someone actually, you know, sort of takes away this little piece from underneath us, and it can also collapse a whole structure of qualities and values that we have if such situation happens. This happens often when people are faced with something that really changes their paradigm, shifts their point of view. You know, it can be deadly, literally. And so obviously we are here thinking beings, and I'm only sharing ideas here. I don't want to cause you any harm. I do consider myself Polish, and I'm still open to consider these ideas as true and potentially useful. And so the theory that the analysis that the authors point out is that the nation state is right now in demise. And this is twofold. One is related to the finance, obviously, and I'm pretty sure it's quite obvious for us to see, even if we choose not to, you know, willfully, if we choose to be willfully blind and turn the gaze away. The nation state is just inefficient in financial administration. The taxes are only getting higher, and you're getting taxed with inflation as well. And if you don't understand how inflation is taxing you, then please educate yourself. And like this is just this is essential for understanding how economy and inflation works. And it's also overgrown and overcomplicated and over-corrupt. So the nation states these days, especially the ones that we are dealing with, you know, there is a huge amount of administrators doing very inefficient tasks. We pay in taxes more than is given to us in the benefits, and there seems to be a constant striving for promising more benefits, while we can see these benefits are not bringing the solutions and the remedies that they are sort of promising to be bringing. And so this is actually a big part, the financial demise of the nation state. And interesting quote here that I've written down for you is the nation state facilitates systematic territorially based predation, for example, taxes or conscription. So, you know, just to bring the point home, we have an area that now the nation state is the guy with the biggest stick of, and they might say, we need you to pay a little bit more because we're trying to help you. And you're kind of put in this situation that you have no choice, right? Like, on one hand, you can say, well, my taxes are not actually benefiting me, so why am I paying? On the other hand, if you don't pay, you'll get in trouble. So is it really something that we choose to do freely? I don't know. We're definitely inclined not to be troubled. And maybe that's the only basis on which I could say that it's a free choice of I'd rather not be troubled by the government than be troubled. But yeah, so this is the one part of the nation state's demise. And the second part of the nation state's demise is obviously this inability to control anymore, although some countries unfortunately are trying to do so, to control our freedom of information. It is very easy right now to directly communicate and gain sources of information from abroad. And so it's much easier for people to see how they could live elsewhere or how people are living elsewhere. And that causes a big trouble for the country, for the nation state, right? If your local propaganda has to be can be debunked in minutes by someone just turning on their phone and showing the local situation happening, how it's happening, for example, with wars, it greatly disturbs this sort of monopoly on information that the nation state used to have back in the 19th or 20th century. So these two factors, the financial and the information, it seems to be bringing nation state to its demise. An interesting thing here to note, which is really, I think, up to date, before I bring us back to the 15th century church for a moment, for a little laugh, with a tear maybe, is this idea of racism and division. The authors point out that this victimization and dividing people on the basis of racism, gender, whatever, is a very useful way of turning people's gaze away from the problems of the nation state. So, for example, because abortion laws or racism, inequality are such emotionally packed ideas, such difficult, topics, and emotionally, just loaded, it's very easy for the government to point out to those things again and again, because it brings our gaze away from, for example, financial difficulties. It's much more boring and less emotional to consider how inflation is affecting us over the past few years, if at the same time we keep screaming at one another about what it is to be XYZ, because one is much closer to our emotional self, and emotions have a tendency of being much easier to manipulate. It's much more difficult to manipulate someone who's not emotional than to manipulate someone who is very emotional. So please be aware as you get to hear about all the devising, ideas and racism and anything like that. Please be aware that these might be ask yourself maybe, is that person, that government official or that, politician or whatever, are they using this as a sort of little smoke and mirrors strategy to not make me see what's going on, for example, with my taxes or with my local community? And an interesting fun fact that I didn't mention earlier is politics emerged as a side effect and a creature of increasing need for increasing need to control the power of aggression without aggression, right? So words, you can fight with words rather than swords. It's much more efficient. And so, yet again, coming back to this politicking and these ideas that politicians these days are putting across to us, an over-exaggeration of topics that are emotional might be a way of turning your gaze away from topics that are actually a bigger problem. And so the government obviously can how do you call it? excuse their faults in a budget deficit or problems with financials if they tell you that at the same time they're trying to fight for equality and they need bigger taxes to help the underprivileged or whatever. So yeah, these are just some ideas that the authors point out to be wary of. Now, final fun fact before we wrap it up is about the church in the 15th century, because that just blew my mind. So, maybe you're familiar with it, but for example, on Fridays in Catholicism and in Christian faith, you're supposed to not eat meat. And the authors have an explanation for that. And it's actually much less holy as you might think. So the church between the 10th and the 15th century grew in power and administrative heaviness as the nation states over the past few centuries, which also meant that there was growing deficit in budget for the church. It was growing, the whole structure was becoming more and more complex, and it was more expensive to keep the church being a church. And so they had to come up with more and more schemes to get money. And some of them are just absurdly nefarious. So one of them is, funnily enough, in the 15th century, the Pope had a monopoly on granting licenses for hookers. Yeah. So that's a fun fact for you. Secondly, they had a monopoly on indulgences. An indulgence was a sort of a fine that you could pay to the church for sinning, for doing anything you want wrong. Maybe you sinned and you killed someone. If you managed to pay the church enough to absolve you, they did. Maybe you slept with someone that you were not meant to sleep with. Pay the church, you're absolved, no problem, go again. So they were getting money from anything. It's absurd. And then the thing about the Friday Lent came about because the church had a monopoly on fishing in Europe in 15th century. And so when meat became widely available as a sort of cheap option for people, it quickly became obvious that people were more likely to buy meat than fish, which were overpriced and under the monopoly of the church. And so what the church did was they announced that on Fridays it's Lent, it's for, it's a God's day for not eating fish, not eating meat, because that ensured that at least one day a week people would be buying fish from their business. Yeah. So, and one note that I've taken here is as well that beware that compassion is often an excuse for extortion. It's easy for us to be taken advantage of if someone first offers us a story that seems that they are compassionate about something or someone. So just beware of this compassionate signaling, as someone might actually be taking advantage of you. Now, taking all this into account, guys, I just wanted to say this critique that might have appeared from this book and also from my approach, especially about the church, does not mean that I don't believe. The church and faith are very different things, in my opinion. The church is an institution. Especially that church was definitely an institution and a bad one, I would say. Definitely nefariously organized. This does not diminish your faith and your religion. And I think ultimately it comes back to your own choice. You don't need anyone, any institution to be the way you want to be and to do you want to do. So my faith in God might be unwavered while I laugh at the 15th century Pope, who was apparently also organizing orgies, which is just, you cannot, come up with this. It's just so absurd. So yeah, I just wanted to reassure you that this is not a critique of the faith or the religion, rather, the institution. In terms of the invitation, as I said at the very beginning, my deepest invitation would be read this book. If this is the only book you read this year, read it. Please. I don't know if there is a more relevant book among the ones that we've discussed recently for the climate that we're in today, and especially the very end of the book, which I purposely skipped because I don't want to, spoil you all the fun, is practical and useful for you as you go into your own life. And if you are, as I know some of you are, at a similar stage in life as me, it might be very beneficial to consider these things and to have a chance to reflect on them in the context of your own existence. So I deeply, really, really, really encourage you to check it out. Now, the second invitation I have for you here is to think about your values and recognize that there are ways through which you can choose whether and where you want to live. And this applies, to these ideas we've shared earlier about the information, the communication, and cryptocurrency. We are becoming more and more interconnected, and therefore we are becoming more and more independent. You can change where you want to live. If you plan to move in 5 years' time somewhere else, you can make it happen. And if you are from one of the countries that are disadvantaged in moving, which is a very sad thing, but it happens. I've witnessed it firsthand, and I also know some of my friends, for example, from Pakistan that are struggling to move to Europe, for example. I just want to reassure you, you still can do it. It might just take a bit more effort, but independence in finance definitely opens quite a few doors than other things don't. And so this is also why I think this book is so relevant and important, is it might be the beginning of you thinking differently about the way, where, when, how, and why you want to live. And I think that's a very empowering thought to consider. So yeah, other than that, sorry if there was any sounds bustling about. I heard my flatmate was saying goodbye to his boyfriend, so I'm pretty sure the door slammed once. Pardon these sounds. We are all humans here. I deeply appreciate your sticking with me for an hour. That's crazy. I hope that this was useful and interesting. And have a wonderful week. Stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time.